Buenas tardes a todos los participantes y bienvenidos al taller sobre evaluación ex
Good
post.
afternoon to all the participants and welcome to the workshop on the evaluation of ex post evaluation in Colombia that we have organized on part of the Regulatory Convergence for Medical Device project. As a part of the Standards Alliance Phase 2, supported by the U.S. Agency for International Development, American National Standard Institute, and the Inter-American Coalition for Regulatory Convergence in the medical technology sector. I am Sandra Ligia Gonzalez, and I am the Executive Secretary of the coalition. I have the honor of coordinating this session. We thank the invaluable collaboration of the National Planning Department, the Ministry of Health, the Ministry of Commerce, Industry and Tourism to take this training to all the participants of the working group that will apply the ex post evaluation for the decrees 4725 and 3770. Before the presentations, let's go through some logistic topics to develop a productive session. Because of the size of the audience, all the participants have their microphones closed to avoid any background noise. And as we indicated in the beginning, this session has been recorded and simultaneously translated into English for sharing later on with the interested in the topic. If you want to listen to the presentation in the English, on the bottom of the screen, you have the button interpretation, and you can choose the language you prefer. Please write your questions in using the button Q&A on the bottom of your screen in a way that in punctual moments of the presentations, we can read them to the speakers. On the screen now, you can see the agenda of the day with the topic that has helped propose the Colombian National Planning Department. Without further ado, let me present our speakers. We have Jimena Padilla, the leader of regulatory improvement of the State Modernization Group of the National Planning Department, economist, lawyer, and master in public policies. She has participated in the process of design and construction of public policies in national and territorial levels. We have Viviana Moura. He is economist with knowledge in design and implementation of public policies for regulatory improvement. She has experience with multilateral entities like the Inter-American Development Bank and the World Bank, and now is bound with the National Planning Department, working with the best practices for regulatory governance. She has followed the implementation of the ex-ante and ex-post normative impact analysis, trying to find the generation and capacities for the institutions. She also leads the international cooperation and institutional cooperation for regulatory improvement. She has received a master's by the public management in public management by the Barcelona Autonomous University. Jimena and Viviana, thank you for your participation, and the floor is yours.
Claro que sí, Sandra Ligia. Muchas gracias por la introducción.
Thank you, Sandra Ligia, for the introduction. And now we thank as well the participation of all of you in this event, this initiative that we have USAID and the Inter-American Coalition for Regulatory Convergence, and we understand the importance of the convergence and the collaboration internationally. Together with me, we have Jimena, the leader of the team that has led this effort of generating capacity. And more than the tools in itself, we are interested in generating capacities in the institutions to ensure the implementation of the tools So the agenda we propose for today is that we are going to have an introductory part where we are going to talk briefly of regulatory governance. In the previous session, Hernan from the Ministry of Commerce has talked a little about that in general. And now we are going to consider the governance to locate the ex-post evaluation topic. Then we are going to discuss the importance of evaluating, and we propose develop this conversation in a way of a workshop, so we can, based on a practical case, consider the concepts that some of you may have known about this topic. And after that, we are going to talk about the steps for an exposed evaluation for a regulation. Thank you, Viviana, for the introduction. Good afternoon to all of you, and thank you for the space that is so pertinent for discussing these topics, considering exposed evaluation tools. And today, the idea is to consider this regulatory cycle and the steps that somehow based on which we develop and we expedite the evaluation and the regulation, and then what would be the importance of the ex-post evaluation of such regulation. So to start in this cycle, the evaluation is the last step, and it's somehow out of the expedition and the design and the conclusion publication of the regulation itself. And it's part of this later dynamics of the expedition of the regulation, because we want to know a posteriori the aspects, the impact of this regulation and the behavior it has. So in this way, inside this regulatory governance cycle, you have on its term a connection. And it's somehow this last step, the evaluation, is connected to the first one, that is planning. So inside this cycle, you see that the evaluation is the last step, but also is the one that precedes the beginning of a new cycle, because based on its results, the results we can observe in the evaluation, we can again design a regulation and apply it in terms based on the findings in this evaluation. So in this sense, we would say that the importance of evaluating is, first of all, asking ourselves if the regulation is meeting the objectives it was proposed to. And it has sense because often the regulations are applied in a punctual moment for punctual needs, but it ends up being a picture of that moment where it was developed, and social and economic and political dynamics change. And what we try to do with the evaluation is identify if in fact, after some time of application, the goals were met, and if the problematic that were aimed at solving with this regulation were really solved, and if the regulation still has the effect, or it may be that in that moment you can identify some problems or some adverse effects related to that regulation, either because the conditions have changed and require new measures, or new problems have come up, or maybe the regulation started start being implemented and new elements are shown as something that didn't work. So what we want is to be able to identify these topics to see if they are working well or not, and based on that, be able to propose improvements for that regulation. And to complement something that Jimena mentioned is that with the goals, with the challenges that we have for ex-post evaluations, one of those is comparing what happened versus what was expected to happen. And so this is the key part when we are designing a regulation. And we have the normative impact analysis, because when we have this impact, we have to consider the problem and the information requirements. In that step, we have the information to feed the evaluation step. So I would just like to call the attention to that, and also something that we can see inside this process, that we have one step that is the public consultation about the regulation. We have designed in the second step, but we also have a public consultation in a transversal way. That is, we look and we stimulate as a best practice the practice of having this public consultation all the time inside our regulatory agenda, in all the steps, and also take into consideration this evaluation document, which is, of course, the last step for the ex-post evaluation of the regulation. And now I would like to continue with what was mentioned before. So let's say, as we said before, we have an ex-post evaluation guideline, the steps that we follow. But in reality, in the real exercise, things are more complex. When we see the guidelines, we see, of course, on paper, it seems easy. But when we face reality, it gets a little more complicated. So the idea here is to use this moment we have now to show a practical case. This one is for personal data protection, a decree. And that topic is interesting to all of us, and we can have an opinion, of course. So in this practical case, we propose this. So let's consider the ex-post evaluation of the Decree 1377 of 2013, which has to do with the regulation of constitutional rights for all the person to know, supply, update, and rectify all kinds of personal data collected and stored by private and public entities, and it will take place by the National Planning Department, and it has the purpose of measuring the efficiency and the efficacy of this regulation. So is it ensuring the rights it's proposed to ensure? So here we have a brief explanation of where should we start by. And here we see there's a question on the chat. And when we talk about guideline, is it a document, a text that we have published in our website? We can share the link with you. So it's a methodological guideline where you have in more details all the steps that we are mentioning here. And something that Viviana mentioned is that how the normative impact analysis can really impact all that. So the design we propose of a regulation, the cycle that is proposed is connected, and it's all very important to follow the sequence and be very strict on that, because during the design and normative impact analysis, so when we have a problem and we are assessing how the alternatives to solve it, we are defining the reach and what will be the criteria that later on I'm going to use to assess the regulation. So this is to connect with these steps we're going to start talking now. So when we are going to have an ex post evaluation of a regulation, where should we start by? So we have a regulation, and so we have to consider the criteria to identify these aspects in the ex post evaluation, and we propose 9 steps to cover the sequence we should follow for an ex post evaluation. And so in general terms, what we do is defining the need of evaluating. And later on, we define when the evaluation will take place. Then I'm going to define the reach of the evaluation. So where are we heading at? Who is going to participate on this evaluation? This is very important as well. So it's important to have a broader discussion with public consultation process for this evaluation. Fourth step is identifying the actors involved in the regulation, the study variables we are going to use to see if the regulation met or not the objectives, and in what measure has it done that or not. And then we identify the sources of information. Then we move on by defining the type and method of evaluation. Then we will outline conclusions and recommendations to finally have a public consultation of the report. So it means that the ex post evaluation and methodology is this evaluation that at the end it becomes a document where you put on all the steps, and that document, the resulting document with the conclusions and recommendations, will talk about the approach, the analysis, and this document will be submitted to public consultation, and all the stakeholders in citizens and all stakeholders that would be interested in participating. So on a first moment, as a preliminary step, and here we will talk it very quickly. So we have the 3 first steps for an ex post evaluation. So the first one is establishing the need of having an evaluation. So not always and not all regulations will go through this evaluation because these topics imply resources, time, and often use of energy. So we're not going to assess all the time. That's why you have to define the need very clearly based on some criterion as first of all,
regulaciones que en gran medida tengan altos efectos económicos y sociales, altos impactos, digamos.
High impact, let's say, impact in society, what the impact it could have, let's say, some benefits and costs that we can identify and that we consider to be very high. You have good or adverse effects, and also to take into account that in its normative impact analysis, when you do the normative impact analysis, that you have contemplated that potentially this regulation could have high costs of implementation. Because the normative impact analysis, what we do is try to anticipate or try to foresee what will be the costs implicated. So this later on, after the identification, we recommend to establish when to do this evaluation. That is very important because maybe let's try to explain when I'm going to do the assessment. How long? 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, and that depends on certain factors. Generally speaking, a recommendation that we could do is that at normal conditions, we propose that the evaluation should be done 5 years after implementation, when it's actually enforced, okay? Not when they started to be actually enforced, and then we count 5 years. So since it started, the implementation is enforced, we count around an average of 5 years and on to be able to have some preliminary results that would allow us to assess the results of this, to assess this normative. So, and there's other variables that can have an impact. We can do an assessment before 5 years. We could say 2, 3 years on average. And what we could see is that the regulation had some high impacts, but those high impacts and adverse impacts that happened as well. So let's say the regulation was enforced to try to solve some problems, but ended up creating more urgent issues that we cannot wait till 5 years to have the evaluation. So, but it's also important to mention there are some topics and sectors that could go through an evaluation that can happen, for example, in health, in healthcare, maybe we could wait assessments that will happen every like 8 or 10 years, depending on the regulation. So establishing when to do this evaluation will depend, generally speaking, and the conditions, but ideally we can recommend every 5 years once or after 5 years once the norm has been implemented. And then we will later define the scope of this normative, and the idea is to then you have to look the regulation that I have and assess what and how. If I have a regulation about a certain topic, if I'm going to do the evaluation about this topic or as a whole, or one specific part within this regulation, or if I'm going to do it on a set of regulations, for example, that could be bundled together. And it's very important to define that initially and identify what we could manage and what we are looking for with this assessment. Okay. Considering that, is there any sort of regulation that, legally speaking, is there any requirement for technical regulations? That's our audience today mainly. And that's what you mentioned before, what Ernan from the Trade Department was telling us. And that's exactly this sort of regulation that require some sort of evaluation every, well, 5 years after implementation. So every 5 years, you have to evaluate the whole regulatory milestone. So everything needs to be evaluated every 5 years. So just like we have these criteria here, there are general criteria. We have some criteria that are applicable by law. So we can just to add. So okay, there's something that we Taking into account what we just talked about, I'd like to ask you a few questions. You have a poll here in our platform. So I'm gonna invite you to think about in case. So in this case, first question, considering personal data protection. So it's important to consider this regulation as a high impact. Yes or no? If there are any risk associated to the non-compliance with the regulation, if we believe that 5 years is enough time. You remember that this was a decree issued in 2013, okay? So we have several answers already, right? Ready? A few more seconds and ready. I can see that we have people participating, so let me share. Let me share the answers here. Okay, the result. Yes, effectively, that's of course the idea is in this case that the effect of this sort of regulation in terms of what are the people affected by the scope of its application is general. So yes, we can consider that this regulation is a high impact regulation. It affects all of us. On the other hand, yes, there are risks associated to the non-compliance with the regulation. Let's remind you that the idea of this decree is exactly to protect the constitutional right of personal rights. So, and we comply with this criteria of, yes, there are risks associated in complying with the regulation. And has it, we had enough time? Yes, 7 years it's since this regulation was issued. So yeah, enough time. Okay. Now, so to think a little bit more about this case, what are the questions that should we ask considering what is abstract and what we've mentioned before? And let's start with the assessment. In this case, Decree 1377 of data protection, personal data protection. And the idea is to identify it as priority this regulation, considering its social and economic high impact. And we have also identified that there are pre-existing market failures, and there is an asymmetry between consumers and those who own the information, all are citizens, and facing those who have the information, public and private entities. So there is an asymmetry of information that we have previously identified, and that's a market failure. So that gives us some hint that is important to do this evaluation. And as we said before, there are risks associated with non-compliance regulation in terms of integrity and confidentiality of personal data. Ready? Okay, considering when to establish, when to perform the evaluation, as Jimena was saying in the beginning, that we know that with over time, regulatory frameworks, they lose effectiveness in solving problems, depending on the topics they are trying to regulate, because we want to keep it up to date to protect personal data. We are going to do these sort of evaluations, and that's a criteria. Time has passed, in this case, 7 years since the implementation of this decree, this regulation. And besides all that, we have another tip here that we're going to see this further, that we have some hints that this regulations has raised the tax load for companies, and it's and for the state, to implement the regulation. So we need to plan this evaluation to avoid or try to mitigate the negative effects. Okay, let's carry on. Actually, in the chat, we have people asking about how to define the scope, and that's what we're going to talk about here. Well, to define the scope of the evaluation, we've said before in general terms, we first to identify on what we're going to do this evaluation. The whole regulation, one specific topic, part, a bundle of parts. So further on, the idea is to identify as if to go back to the general objectives of these regulations when it was issued. And then we go back to, we were talking before, the regulatory framework. Sometimes it's hard to do the evaluation of a regulation because it's not very clear how is this memory of for what we did this regulation at that time. So here it's very important to identify before we start up what was the problem when this regulation was issued, why it was issued, because we issued a regulation for some reason. So what was this regulation trying to solve? What was the problem under the underlying problem? What was the issues that, and what were the alternatives that were taken into account and that wasn't selected? So what were the effects that were that happened once the regulation was implemented? And here, of course, it's we're going to the evaluation now, but we need to identify what are these issues, and we can start by doing some sort of cloud of what we have noted throughout time when we implemented this regulation, and what the relationship between intervention and the effects that we can see in real life. So we need to bring it out to the table because that's going to be the outcome of the evaluation that we do. Some of the effects that we can see, either they negative or positive, they are not necessarily coming from the regulation. It could be from external factors, and that is important to take into account as well when we define the scope of this evaluation. What are the parties being consulted for this evaluation? That's very important to see who and how it was this implemented, how this regulation was implemented, how was this evaluated at the time of implementation. And then we go back again, and that has to do with the normative impact analysis that we talked about before. So when from one regulation that I have, I'm going to evaluate it in the more appropriate way as possible. But if you have a regulation that happened or that came to life based on a normative impact, everything will be easier for us because we have this memory for this normative impact analysis. When you discuss how pertinent it is to have a regulation and what are the alternatives that should be taken into account to intervene or not, and why we're going to intervene, and moreover, what is, as it's a part of the normative impact, what is the underlying problem that we're trying to solve? So, and finally, we can do some sort of to identify the indicators that could be established and in the scope of this evaluation. Starting from these questions that Jimena was trying to explain, to try to cement the scope of this evaluation, we have some other questions that will be very important for the case, right? So we have this poll here. If the need of intervention, the state intervention derives the progress, the technological and digitalization progresses. So because it has to do, data, personal data protection has to do with technological and digitalization progress. So I have some questions regarding this evaluation analysis exposed. So I have to ask you, what started this? What were the initial goals? And what was the reason for the state intervention in this problem? And the second question is, the cost of regulation has to do with the protection of citizens' rights. Of course, we have the two sides of a coin. So in this case, the cost had to do with protection, direct cost to do with the regulation directly. So so I wish, yeah, I see that you guys are participating, and here I have the results. Okay, let's see. Ready. So let's start thinking about the case. Yes, there's a need of the state intervention, and it happened based on the technological and digitalization progress. And with the change of scenario, when we relate with the state, but also the private sector, because we are consumers. And as you mentioned before in the chat, when we consider like clinical trials or clinical studies and all the medical history. So of course, we have a different way to treat this data. And now, if you want to protect this data, if you want to have control of who can see and who cannot see our data, we have, because these are like our own personal information. So there is the need of a state intervention in this case, and that has to do with all the changes that are coming throughout time, especially starting in those realities of state intervention to protect our rights. Okay, so the second question that's related with regulation is the following. I was talking about, in this case, the protection of human rights that is part of the benefits of this regulation. Cost has also to do, the cost of implementation that we mentioned before, and also this cost has to do with the public and private entities that must comply with the regulation. So it's kind of more divided. The answer was divided in the second case.
Entonces, volviendo al caso práctico, digamos.
So going back to the practical case, and we see the questions we have asked. So we can define the reach of the problem. And so based on an aspect before we define the problem to be solved, in this case, personal data, where we need an intervention of the state because of the new dynamics in the market. And we have to consider the options of policies that were considered at that moment. And another topic that has to do with this discussion, and we can see from the options of policies, one is that tries to regulate, but we can approach the problem in another way. So in this case, the decree was meant to adapt somehow the European continental standard. And also, of course, other possibilities were considered, as all the self-regulating approaches based on associations. So we will have the management of clinical stories where they could generate their own regulation, and as an association, they can bring their associates together to follow some specific policy. And now to give you an introduction it was what we had planned. And now we can consider something else, that is the impact of the regulation. So we need to know what was the information requirement we're going to need as well. So we have information from the industry and commerce superintendents. We have organizations that have applied policy for personal information protection. And so they don't have mechanisms with the required efficiency for protecting the data of their users. So here we have an information that helps us think on the impacts of that regulation. And the second information has to do with the second question, which is the benefits, the real benefit for the citizen, the ones that will protect, of course, the benefit of the regulation would be protecting the right we have of having our personal information protected. And for the year 2020, over 33,000 companies and public entities didn't meet or met partially the demands of that measure. So we see the regulation is generating a charge. So the people that have to apply it are not able to do so. Following on, moving on with our steps, as a fourth step, after defining the reach and the need for evaluation, we have to identify the actors, the parts that are involved in the results, because you can see upfront who will be impacted by the changes in regulations. And in a direct manner, these are the people that are involved in the implementation of the regulation and somehow are part and are beneficiary or are affected in a way by the impacts by the regulation in any way. So there are positive, negative impacts in terms of costs, and depending on the sector and the dynamics, there will always be people that will be affected and also people that will be beneficiary of a regulation. So it is important to identify them to be able to define the effects of that regulation firsthand. It's also important to identify in this citizen, if the citizen is affected or if it's a beneficiary, we also have to consider interest groups and the people that enforce, the people that implement a regulation. So they somehow may help us understand what happened with the process of implementing a regulation. So effectively, the task here is having and mapping the actors, the people that are involved, the parties that are involved in this process, and we can use some exercises to do so. So an entity asks us guidelines on how to do that. So sometimes we have a process that is captured by some of the actors that are part of the problem and participated on the implementation, but some people may be left out. So we have to identify the problem in its complete dimension and obtain all the information that we need to evaluate the regulation. So with the practical case in mind, I'll ask you, for this poll, how we would identify these groups. Number one, the beneficiary would be the citizens and the consumers with their relation with either the state or the productive sector, yes or no, or for number two, who will be the ones implementing it? Would be the companies and the state. So they have to do with the execution, the vigilance, and the control. Thank you for your participation. The idea is really to, as we have a huge group, we can't have it more interactively as we normally do, but somehow we can have you participating in this way. So these are the results. And here it was super easy. The beneficiary would be the citizens and the consumers. For this regulation for personal data protection, so they are the subject matter of the law. And who would implement it? Of course, companies, the state, but in this case, we have a key actor would be the industry and commerce superintendents. They are responsible for inspecting if the companies are in compliance and have protocols in place to really go through with the process of maintaining the user's information private. So here we have the affected groups. That would be the state and the companies, because we identify that on them the weight of the regulation lies. So for sure, when we identify and evaluate the process, we are going to see how much it would cost to them to implement these protocols of personal protection. So, for fifth step, considering the exercise of an evaluation, we have the theory of change and the the definition of indicators. In the first step, in the previous step, we talked about the actors and the reach of the evaluation. Now you identify something more punctual, more practical to understand what would be the inputs I'm going to use to somehow say materialize the impacts and what would be the activities I'm going to define for the evaluation of what would be the results, the products I'm going to take into consideration, and finally, aligned with the objectives of the regulation, we can consider the kinds of evaluation we can think of, but also, finally, the impacts. But if you think of the products, the third step here, it's what is what derives from the activities that are taking place day to day to really comply with the regulation. And the final part, the impact, is what would be the accrued effects in the long term generated by a regulation. So how does it work and how is it connected? So if we think of input, that is available, the activities that were carried out, what would be the results, what they were expected, and what were achieved in terms of products as well. We can think of the impact of these activities, and finally the impacts in general for the regulation.
Sí, perdona, me voy a pasar esa porque está muy pequeñita la información allí. Yo creo que podemos pasar acá.
I just skipped to one slide because the writing is very small. You can't read it. So now for the sixth step, when I identify input, activity, product results, and the impact, I have the sixth step, that is the identification of the information source. It is very important that the previous step, we identify what we call a micro identification to go to this step where you identify the information that will be used and will be assessed, and we will take into consideration to to reach the conclusions we want with this evaluation, depending on the topic, depending on the context. Of course, they will change, but it's important to know how to read and analyze the data in, against what we are expecting to find. So we have some data that is more institutional. We have our own data that we may have compiled with the entities, some data from different actors of the private sector, for instance. And we have some international studies. So identifying it in a macro term, what you have about the topic, because at the end, they may be used internally to help us understand the impact of a regulation, but in general terms, we can measure some more punctual objectives we have defined, like inside an entity or inside an industry. But in general term, you can also see the impacts in the society. So how can the regulation affect other beneficiaries? And we have a little of all of that to identify what are the other worlds that are somehow involved, or maybe a little more indirectly involved with the implementation of one regulation. And based on that, we can also evaluate the effects and take all of these effects into consideration too. Now I'd like us to reflect, because it may seem simple. You collect information and there it is, but the exposed evaluation exercises we are following up, this, we know that this step is key, and we emphasize the importance of understanding this impact, because if we have not identified that since a decree was published, we may understand how the cost and how it is increasing the cost for our company, for instance. So since the beginning, I haven't defined mechanisms to generate the information. When I'm going to outline the exposed evaluation, I don't have quality information, or I don't have the information at all. So this is an important step in the beginning when I define the regulation, because when I identify and design the regulation, it has to be taken into consideration as well when I plan my evaluation as a governance cycle. In the previous analysis and the impact analysis, I have to identify that I need to generate some specific kind of information, because when I get to this state, I need to have the information. So this is a practical note to help you. And just because of the time, we are going to skip now and speed up a little and go to step 7. And as Viviana was saying, all these topics, we know they are not, as we said, as easy. It's easier said than done, of course, but when there are something that we have to identify, it is the challenges. So it's important to take into consideration all the challenges you can have in each step, because in this step, for instance, you talk about selecting the type and the method of evaluation. And many of the information source can provide some information that allows us to make one kind or another kind of evaluation. And so inside the implementation, you have to take into consideration.
Puntos de partida y esos puntos a los
And
que
so
queremos llegar.
these are the starting points, and this is the results. All of this has to be revised in the 7th step then, and we're reaching the end. We have something that's really important and depends on the previous one, which is defining then the type and the method of evaluation, because the definition, and now we can consider different methodologies of evaluation you could use, but this evaluation method is chosen based on several factors. One of them is the information you have available. Obviously, if you have good qualitative information, for instance, when you have a reasonable time of information to be assessed, and from this information you can get some causality. Of course, we could use an impact evaluation.
Ello, bueno, tendríamos que tener un contrafactual, o sea,
For
en sí
this, we need to consider other factors. So first of all, we need to decide what would be the methodology to be used, and that depends on the information that we have. If we don't have quantitative information that are reliable, let's say we can do what I just mentioned before. We can have interviews or surveys, more qualitative information. So we can do it like passively or actively, or we can use like mixed methodologies. Here, what is important to do is to understand the types of evaluation, and that will depend on what we want to have at the end of our evaluation. If we want to have at the end what are the outcomes of the evaluation, then We have to identify if we reached our goals or not, the impacts of this regulation. If you want to check the performance, we need to measure the efficiency of the execution and quantify the level of compliance when we implement the regulation, or we can have a process evaluation, and that's going to go more connected to validate the compliance of implemented actions, what has been suggested. So it's more general. We can analyze different types or different factors, not only the process or the performance or the results. And each one of them will give us a different dimension. And at the same time, that can be complementary. So yeah, here, let's get a little bit further in the evaluation method. As you could see, there are different ways to do it. And as Jimena was saying, it depends on the availability of information and what we want, what we need. If we need to identify the impact of the process, but normally what we do is depend on the information we have. So basically, sometimes we have some institutions that will go for the cost effectivity, the cost, how cost effective it is, or the cost benefits of this regulation. These are more quantitative data and more robust, of course, but the problem is not always we manage to quantify like net benefits of the regulation. So not always it's possible to have a cost benefit of evaluation or a cost benefit assessment. So sometimes what we end up doing in terms of the methodology is to have a multi-criteria analysis. In this case, normally what we do is that happened with health care issues because it's hard to monetize the benefits of the regulation. They are hard to monetize. So, and that's why in this sense, we cannot analyze it that way. But we can also identify if we can identify the benefits, we can define what will be the construction criteria to assess these benefits. I'm not going to get further because we have a lot of information here and we have different ways of doing it, and we depend on the goals that we are looking for, and it also depends on the information that we have available and the nature of the problem. So now we are almost finished here, and finally in the document that we have, that's a report, and what we want is to connect these three options. People were asking us in the chat box if we would possible to have this third alternative. Yes. Yep. So let's say that in the 8th step, we have the definition of the methodology that you're going to use, and then we expand it, and then we apply this methodology in order to process the information that we have and try to get draw some conclusions from all this information in order to identify what happened to this regulation. And on the second step here, and the 8th step, I'm sorry, when you get to the conclusion, and that's the stage of drawing the conclusions and preliminary recommendation, and what we can conclude based on 3 line of thoughts here. Let's say in this framework, we have like 3 options. Let's say one is that the shows that the regulation has been positive, that it had benefit, considerable benefit. It met the objective of why it was issued. And for this reason, you're going to maintain the regulation. However, there's something important here, and we are going through some conclusions here. And sometimes it's hard to identify to see if they're meets the expectation for the time it was assess it. We expected to have some sort of results, and the results didn't meet all these expectations. But we can identify through the framework that there were some external factors that have affected the process and so on and so forth. So we can consider that we could maintain the regulation for the time being, because it didn't comply completely or strictly the goals that it was supposed to. But there's another line of thought that from this report, from the conclusions, and it has to do with the recommendation of making some changes or adjustments to this regulation in order to try to correct some of the things that are not working properly. For example, let's say add some other elements, because maybe some of the situations that the reason why it's not working properly, they aren't working properly because there was some changes in economic or social dynamics or market dynamics. And further on, we had like what we have today, like COVID-19, that added a lot of changes in our lives, and some of the regulations that were enforced, they need to go through some changes. So somehow there are some of the goals of this regulation that need to be adjusted because we have changes at the social and society level, and that requires us to go after different goals or change our objectives. And as a third line of this framework, and based on the report, we can recommend the elimination of this regulation, that maybe it's not as it doesn't follow the reality of the society, or maybe because it's not necessary anymore because the market has corrected itself, or maybe this topic is not pertinent anymore. So we don't need to have this regulation anymore. So based on the evaluation report, we will decide what are the lines that we are going to follow and how to proceed. And then you're going to go back to the cycle, because here it's important to highlight that when we were talking about this regulation, we need to, there is the possibility of going back and reviewing this regulation and go after the process, design it again through a public consultation and so on and so forth. Yeah, I think we finished with this step. For us, it's key to have the public consultation exercise and transparency, especially because it helps us to consult with the stakeholders and do it internally. Sometimes within the entities, we think that we understand the problem perfectly and what would be the solution. And at the end of the day, if we don't consult with our stakeholders, we may not share the same ideas. So the idea is to do a poll, and that's important. So basically, that's the public consultation exercise that we have to do in 3 steps. And we're going to decide first what our audience. We do the public consultation, we produce this outcome. It's not, we cannot hide it in our webpage. It must be feasible, and it must be open so people can see what we want to do, and then do an analysis what will be the recommendation that our citizens and our stakeholders had to tell us, and then carry on with the analysis. So I think we finished our story today. We do have questions from the audience. Yes, Viviana, thank you so much. Thank you, Jimena. I think well, in a very short time, we had a very broad and complete presentation and explanation of everything that is part and that are relevant for this process. So we have a question here from Karina Cruz. She asks, the public consultation of this final report can generate changes to the report? Yeah, I can answer that. Yeah, the public consultation at the end of the day, it would be very hard because it would mean to go back and do another evaluation. So if there's something in the measurement that we can change of the impact that been noted in the analysis, it can lead to some changes, but more, but not in the structure, not a very deep into the analysis. Maybe in, let's say, for example, some of the recommendations was one of the recommendations was to eliminate the regulation for good, and there's a comment in this public consultation that will say, hey, if you eliminate this regulation, take into account that there's some aspect here that will be thrown in the limbo, and then there will be an alarm for us, and we could say, okay, yes, we need to take that into account. We could, so maybe we won't be able to eliminate it, or we can include it in a different regulation. So in this case, yes. Generally speaking, on the evaluation in itself, no, it's not feasible to make changes that. But in terms of recommendation to the future, maybe yes, we can take these recommendations into account. Yeah, just to add, considering Karina's question, I think the importance is to do the public consultation horizontally and very early in the process. That's another thing that we have tried to do and I should encourage as good practice. For example, when I'm doing the evaluation, okay, let me go back here. The preliminary considerations, yes. Preliminary considerations, when I'm defining the scope and timing, and I'm asking the relevant questions, considering the goals of this evaluation, I should bring this design to a public consultation, okay? It's also to have a public consultation very early in the process. Once I have identified these preliminary considerations, the scope of the evaluation, and also I have identified, once I identified the scope of the evaluation, what were the initial goals and what was the problem that we wanted to tackle, this document that we have here, with all this information, we should bring to a public consultation very early in the process with our stakeholders to later on, we can get all the, to bring to light things that I wasn't able to see, okay? If we could do this public consultation, because it can affect it, it can make us change. So it's good to do it not only at the end, the public consultation, but do it also at the beginning. I don't know, Sandra Ligia, if you have another question. Yeah, just like to add what you just said, especially regarding the relevance of generating public consultation early in the process, but also what means in terms of opportunities and commitments to stakeholders to participate effectively in public consultation. I think that's co-accountability position. I think so everybody in the process could participate. So at the end of the process, you say, oh, by the way, there was some elements that we didn't note. And that could happen because those who have the possibility to identify these specific elements, they didn't participate effectively. So yeah, that's the idea of having a early consultation. Sí, Sandra, tienes toda you're totally right. This is one of the good practice that we suggest, and to, especially as a co-responsibility of co-accountability, especially from the point of view of the regulators and the sort of regulations we are evaluating. So you have to do it with enough time to prevent leaving things behind or outside of our analysis. Right, yeah. And also we have, Karina has another add to her comment for regulations that have more than 15 years of implementation. The evaluation steps are the same as those for a 5-step regulation. Well, these stage are not basic for a 5 years, 6 years steps to do an ex post regulation, regardless of the time, the how the age of the regulations. Like a 15-year-old regulation, they are already in practice, and we have to do the same exercise. Maybe our challenges are going to be higher. We need to look at the initial goals. We can get more information that can help us to establish what were the needs that there were happening, were taking place at that time when the regulation was issued. So regardless of the age of the regulation, we will follow the same process. Maybe we could go deeper to another regulation. I'd like to mention something here, and it has to do with the age of the regulation, because especially for those two cases that we are working, the 3770, and those are regulations that were issued like a long time ago. And from your experience, what you have seen, what you have experienced, there are different groups in this ex post evaluation for regulations issued such a long time ago. Do you have any specific recommendation to make this process easier, with the certainty that there are going to be missing elements to issue, like newer regulations already take all these elements into account and older regulations don't? So yeah, very good question. Something that we have faced all these issues. One of the topics that we've seen and that's been very important is, first of all, let's say can have an interdisciplinary team that allows to take different kind of point of views of the analysis. Someone who can have a look from a historical point of view, from a political point of view, from figures point of view, to try to understand, because here there's going to be something very important with old regulations. Of course, we cannot assess the same way we could do based on the elements that we have today as a society, because there were many changes throughout time, not only technological changes, but political, social, to understand what were the dynamic. And so we can start and identify the impacts. However, there's another thing, and it's something that we try to take into account, generally speaking, everything that has to do with regulation. Sometimes we tend to be very harsh or very strict, very critical to what they did at that time. So they did it at that time, it's not terrible. It's just that they did it because we have to treat it from today's point of view, of course, but we have to leave the snapshot of today. Of course, today, many of the things that we have today are the landscape. They are given. But at that time, when that regulation was issued, maybe nothing that we have today existed. And because of that, that regulation at that time may have had achievements that today we cannot understand. So we need put uh, uh, to put ourselves in the feet of those in the shoes of those who were issuing the regulation at that time, that long time ago. So thank you.
Preguntas aquí en el apartado.
I don't see any more questions here. Also don't see any other questions in the chat or in the Q&A. So I would like to confirm with the participants, if you have any other question or any other doubt, we thank you because this group is going to be with us in this complete process of the ex-post evaluation, and I'm sure over each of the steps we are going to have questions, and when we see a general landmark, it seems so clear, but when we start thinking of the details and the aspects that we have to cover to be able to ensure a satisfying result for all the parties, that have an impact on based on this analysis, because we are going to make decisions that are very important based on this analysis that is done with this ex-post model. So we understand it's very important, and to have this follow-up is also very, very important. And it's very relevant for all of us to have this exercise of conscience, of knowing the responsibility of our participation by bringing to the table the experience, the knowledge, the resources, the sources of information that can contribute. And in that sense, maybe other questions that I would ask myself while I was listening to them would be, would this analysis be somehow infinite? And the challenge of defining when is enough is really important. That kind of exercise, and if you want to share an experience based on what Jimena's expression says, she has gone through that. So how do you manage that? Yes, Sandra, with the Ministry of Health, we are carrying out an evaluation of a decree for dental supplies, and it took us 4 or 5 months in the first part for the initial considerations, for to design the evaluation. And this is the part that really takes us longer. So limiting where we should be, what would not be more pertinent for that evaluation, and where we have to analyze the whole regulatory act and what came before that regulation. So we had in that situation medication and supplies. So it was a challenge to identify where I'm heading at and where it's enough. So we could go forward to the next step. We have to consider there are limitations, and it is important to inform it in the evaluation. Maybe observing that we should have another evaluation, maybe in 5 years, and document all that is really part of the process as well. Because these topics, for instance, I could say these topics we couldn't cover because it was beyond the limit of this first evaluation, but you can't put that in the final report, so it can be used for the future exercises of evaluation.
Ahí para complementar eso que dice Viviana.
And to complement what Viviana said, It has happened with us, of course, and it is very, very important that you can consider, of course, things will change over the process, but we can say, okay, the discussion has reached this point and the discussion is not going beyond these aspects. So you can try and be a little more concise with the information you already have. Otherwise, it is an endless process. It's true. There will always be something else we could observe or we could go deeper. So it's important to use this exercise, defining a timetable of how the evaluation is going to take place, because over time you can do some things, and of course it can help you setting a limit. It's a kind of a practical strategy to define these internal discussions. And since I have the microphone open, I would like to ask, from your perspective, what would be the 2 or 3 basic recommendations to any participants in an ex post analysis, so they are better prepared for it? Well, I would start by the last one thing Jimena mentioned, which is planning a timetable. So sometimes at that time, the elements of information are not there, but you are clear about what you're going to reach, and you have a working group well defined. It helps. It's hard work. It demands a lot of commitment and time from the employees, and we don't always have it. So this is important to define. If we have one employee, how can you go beyond, go further with your timetable? Because you have an institutional commitment and you have to define the priorities. In the group, when you define priorities, you have to define and align all of that. Otherwise, you can get a little distracted from your goal. And this work can be very exhausting. Thank you. And I don't know if one of the speakers or the attendees, or any body of government, if any ministry, if you want to make any comments, you can open the mic before we conclude the session. Does anybody want to say something? It seems we don't have any more comments, so all I have to do now is thank Viviana. If you want to have any final comments, Viviana? Yes, so I would like to reiterate what we said in the opening, which is the commitment we have with the topic. As we mentioned, inside the priorities we manage in the regulatory improvement, we know the importance of the regulatory convergence, and all of that inside a framework of international cooperation. And we are updating this framework, so this is a topic to be considered. Of course, as you said, we haven't finished the topic of creating capacity with this one session. Of course, we would need much more work, and we have to start, and for the evaluation exercises, when we start having it, the doubts will arise, and any clarification you may need, of course, we are available. And I would like to invite you, we have an appointment to generate capacity with all the steps of the regulatory governance cycle and some other that we have in terms of this cycle in itself. Thank you, Viviana. I would like to thank first the National Department of Planning its cooperation, its guidelines, now that we are planning all these projects for our regulatory convergence for medical technology sector and the medical device. I would like also to thank Vidma, Minsit, and Andy that are getting involved again with all these topics, and it's of course generating value in the development of the processes and the activities. Thank you all for your participation. Remember that on Friday we have the session to start up the work to evaluate, expose evaluation of the decree 4725 and 3770, and where we are going to define the base of how we are going to operate. I would like to thank Viviane for inviting for the capacitations that will be needed during the process, and reiterate the commitment that the availability as a project of convergence, we can provide the way of things to be done. And we are going to have all of this recorded because it can be a complement as a tool that you are developing. And it's important that everyone keep working to know and prepare ourselves for this process. And with that, we conclude the session. We thank you all very much, and we see you all on Friday, and have